Okay, so welcome back to Psychology as a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be video number 3 in a series about existential psychology. In the previous video, what we did was we looked at some of the contributions of Soren Kierkegaard and also Friedrich Nietzsche to existential thought. Of course, that body of thought contributes to existential psychology and ultimately to existential psychotherapy too. In this video, what we want to do is we'll see if we can make our way through the rest of this list of 9 total thinkers, so we have 7 more left to go. Fortunately, I think that this video will go a little bit more quickly because some of these ideas are ones you've already heard of, so it's just a matter of reminding you of something that you already more or less know. And such is the case with the very first thinker we'll take up in this video, so it's Martin Heidegger. You've heard his name before. When we were in the 2 videos on phenomenological psychology, we noticed that he was one of the existential phenomenological thinkers, and here his name appears once again. You could anticipate that basically because he's an existential phenomenological thinker, which means that he's going to have a presence both within phenomenology and also within existentialism. So, Martin Heidegger, you already know that there's a big ontological emphasis in his thinking for sure. The big central question around which all of his work revolves is the question of being. And of course, you also already know that he conceives of being mostly in terms of Dasein, which is to say, being in the world. Once again, let's remind you that that is tantamount to a holistic way of conceiving of the nature of existence. Okay, where what we are as beings are integral to what the world is, and what the world is integral to what we are as beings. Okay, so why is Heidegger so interested in the question of being? Well, there are any number of reasons, but one of them, which he outlines in one of the 2 introductions to Being and Time, his most famous work, has to do with his observation that pretty much the entire Western intellectual trajectory has been ungrounded in any systematic inquiry into the nature of being itself, all the way from the time of the pre-Socratics, okay, so the philosophers prior to Socrates. Now he does localize in some of the pre-Socratics an interest in fundamental ontology. Parmenides and I guess Heraclitus would number among those, but that's a long time for a tradition to go along more or less without any real foundation in any systematic understanding of the nature of being. Basically about 2,500 years is what we're talking about. So what has eventuated because of all of that, of course, with the advent of the Enlightenment period and then the industrial period and now the technological period, has been the evolution of a very technologically based world which is still ungrounded in any real understanding of being. And this, according to this kind of logic, explains to a fair degree why our world is so weird. In case you haven't noticed, you're living in a weird world. Have you figured that one out yet? And part of what makes it weird is the fact that we're sort of going along thinking we're knowing what we're doing as we evolve new technologies and new ways of engaging our attention and evolving a world out of all of that. But actually, we have no idea what we're doing. And the reason why we have no idea is because none of it is really connected to any understanding of being or of, consequently, human being, for that matter. Okay, so maybe at this point you're not convinced that you live in a weird world. So let me point to 1 or 2 things perhaps to give you an inroad into understanding how strange the world really is. Has it ever struck you as odd, for instance, that you're living in a world which, because of industry and the evolution of technology, has been wired for instantaneous nuclear obliteration for approximately the last 70 years or so? Has that struck you as odd, ever? You know, because the reason why it might is because really what the promise of the Enlightenment period was all about is if we can just keep thinking rationally, and inquiring into nature and the realities of nature in a more or less systematic, rational, coherent way, that eventually greater human happiness will evolve out of that, especially by way of things like industry and technology. So basically, the world we've created has been motivated by the very human and understandable desire to be happy. But riding right alongside of all of those great technological innovations, we've somehow managed to wire the entire planet for instantaneous nuclear obliteration because we're trying to be happy. That sort of strange thing, you know. I think it's a strange thing, you know, that how many nuclear armaments are there in the world? Have you ever sort of wondered about this? Well, the current estimate, or at least the last one I read, was 13,700. That's kind of a lot of nukes in the world when you think about it, you know, and if they all were to suddenly go off in some kind of domino effect, you know, which has been a kind of eschatological fantasy for quite a while now. Eschatological, let's improve your freaking vocabulary. So eschatology has to do with the study of the end of the world and the end of the universe and basically end states and the end of times and so on. So it's been a kind of eschatological fantasy for quite some time now. You know, but so what? You know, well, here's the so what. The reason why there are 13,700 nukes in the world, which if they all sort of went off at the same time would pretty much obliterate life as we know it. Well, maybe a couple things would survive, maybe some roaches and some bacteria, and but everything else is pretty much gone, you know. The reason why we've evolved that kind of world is because of Heidegger's observation that, you know, basically we evolve things like that because our efforts are not really rooted in the reality of being itself. And if they were, perhaps we'd be less prone to, you know, fits of self-destruction, or at least imminent self-destruction, you know, in the case of nuclear armaments. So that's basically why you're living in such a chaotic and destructive world. That's why, you know, there's sort of, you know, we use technology to commit genocide and mass genocide. So, okay, nuclear armaments, let's sort of give you another example for you to wonder about. You ever sort of wonder about, like, the prevalence of genocide, especially in the industrial and technological age, let's say the 20th century, because that's a great century for genocide. I mean, we've had the three biggest ones under Stalin, Mao, and Hitler in human history, with the body counts numbering in tens of millions of human beings. Like, you ever sort of wonder, like, what a weird thing that we evolve sort of industries and technologies. And one of the things we do with our industries and technologies is annihilate each other by the tens of millions. Does that ever strike you as sort of odd? And while we're not annihilating each other by the tens of millions, we're constructing things like nuclear armaments that can annihilate us by the billions even. You know, well, it's good to be promoted now and then, but I'm not sure that that's a positive thing in this case. Well, again, the real reason, the deep reason for that is because we have no idea what being is about at all. Consequently, we have no idea what human being is about. Consequently, we just sort of go off on our own, the inertia of our own desires, and usually our baser desires, because that's what tends to rule us until we evolve a little bit further. Well, we tend not to evolve. And why do we tend not to evolve? Because our foundation is missing. Our foundation for any real deep substantive evolution is missing because we have no idea what we are. Aside from that, everything works out just great, and that is sarcasm, by the way. Okay, so let's see how I said it in your notes. Because all of Western science and metaphysics has been fundamentally ungrounded in any systematic study of being, the world we're creating often seems chaotic and destructive, mostly because we're proceeding without any knowing of what we really are or what our relation to the world really is. So, you know, that's also related to why we tend to destroy the natural environment so often. You know, see, like if we were really able to understand ourselves as Dasein as intimately related to the world, then maybe we wouldn't be quite so quick to treat the world like our own personal garbage dump all the damn time, and just sort of a big pit for digging up resources and then filling it in with garbage, sort of like in the movie Wall-E. If you've ever seen that movie, that was how old is that? That might be like 15 or 20 years old by now, so Wall-E, a Disney movie, kind of a cartoon movie, but man, it sort of illustrates our trajectory, like where we're heading. And of course, in the movie Wall-E, the entire Earth has been turned into a garbage dump, and these little sort of cutesy robots are manipulating these huge piles of garbage rising to the sky. And it's like, well, how is it that we end up treating the Earth that way, where that seems like sort of the logical trajectory? Well, it's because we have no sense of felt intimacy between ourselves and the world we inhabit. We don't understand Dasein. We don't understand our being. All right, so that's probably maybe a little too much about that, getting slightly on my soapbox about that, because I think Heidegger's right. That's not the only source of our problems, but it's one, I would say. All right, next thinker. You've heard about this guy too. So Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre, there's sort of two American type pronunciations of this guy's name. So an emphasis on exploring freedom and responsibility. We've already described that in a previous video. Now here's something we have not said, and this comes to us by way of his most famous work, which, as you know, is fill in the blank. Being a Nothingness. Okay, I give you a second to sort of try to remember. All right, and this has to do with conceiving of consciousness in terms of being for itself, being for itself. That's a phrase that's hyphenated, but I give you the shortened version that's much more common, the for itself. That's a way of talking about consciousness, and the in itself. Okay, that's a way of talking about the kind of being that inanimate objects have, like cell phones, for instance, or whatever. Laptops, doing, doing, doing. Nice laptop. Okay, so really what being has to do with, or existence has to do with, is the ongoing correspondence between the for itself and the in itself, and there are a whole bunch of neat tricks and subtleties that evolve out of that. But at any rate, so that's Jean-Paul Sartre. He also wrote numerous novels and plays, as you may know. Like he wrote, one of his more famous novels was Nausea in English, right? And one of his more famous plays is probably No Exit, where he declares at the end that hell is other people, sort of famous or infamous, I guess, depending upon your point of view. So that's Sartre, and I put the next thinker right together with Sartre because she, Simone de Beauvoir, was actually Sartre's lover and confidant and companion and colleague in all kinds of different ways, some of them a little bit salacious, shall we say. Okay, so Simone de Beauvoir, the first bearer of the double X chromosome pair in our list, actually the only bearer of the double X chromosome pair. So what is her biggest claim to fame? Well, she took the ethical implications of Sartre's phenomenological ontology and evolved a much more varied and interesting ethical system out of it, which she presents in a book known as The Ethics of Ambiguity. Did I mention that? No, I did not mention that in your notes. So the central thematic of the Ethics of Ambiguity is that it's basically a meta-ethical system. So what's a meta-ethical system? It's a kind of ethical system that makes sense of other ethical systems. Okay, so it's sort of like a master ethical system. So from her point of view, the central thematic that would validate any ethical system has to do with the tendency toward which it furthers what she calls the practice of freedom. Okay, so there's that very Sartrean insistence on the radicality of freedom and responsibility, this time borne out in Simone de Beauvoir's work. All right, so, and hopefully, given what I said about her, you can sort of anticipate that they were very sympathetic, at least at this point, in their interchanges with each other. So the practice of freedom has to do with deepening and amplifying freedom, both one's own and that of other people. So there's a very social dimension to her existential ethics. That's not true of every existentialist, but for her it really is. And it's really a sort of a neat idea that you can run with as you watch the news, or you watch, let's say, political candidates, because we're in a political season, debating with each other. It's like when you sort of subject their points that they're trying to make to the litmus test of this ethics of freedom idea and practice of freedom idea, the question would be, well, is what they're suggesting, does it tend to amplify and deepen the lived sense of freedom for more people or not? Or is it more a way of hemming that in, sort of a way of making sense of, you know, political phenomena that you can see around us these days, especially in the United States, because we're in a political season here in the United States, so there's lots of political and quasi-political craziness going on. All right, so I try not to get political in these lectures or in my teaching in general because, sidebar moment, I really don't believe that, you know, my purpose in being your teacher is that of political indoctrination. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that it's my role or my job or my prerogative to try to superimpose on you, the students, my own political belief systems. So I take pains not to comment too often, or if I do, it's inadvertent, on you know, my own sort of political take on things. I think that as young adults, part of your task is to figure this stuff out for yourselves and not to have me superimposing from on high whatever my political points of view. Okay, end of sidebar moment. Okay, another thing Simone de Beauvoir was famous for, in fact, she's probably more famous for this than she was for the ethics of ambiguity, is as her work as an early proto-feminist. Okay, so proto sort of means like early or even before feminism proper. Okay, so she wrote a very famous book called The Second Sex during the late 1940s, I believe it was. I'm not exactly positive of the date, but I think it was in the late 1940s. So early feminist for sure. The Second Sex, very famous. All right, so let's go on to number 6. You are number 6. Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Okay, you've heard this guy's name before, so I can sort of go through him relatively quickly. Very big emphasis on embodiment and corporeality and investigating the phenomenological meaning of the fact that we are flesh. Of course, his principal way of thinking about the phenomenological meaning of that is in terms of the body subject, which has to do with this idea that the body, the deep meaning of our body in terms of our experience of embodiment, is not just a system composed of other systems, you know, like digestive system, respiratory system, and so on, but rather is a mode of meaningful, expressive engagement with world. Okay, so this is not your objective, vanilla way of conceiving of the body. Okay, so now, number 7, okay, so this guy's name, you heard it very briefly in that Venn diagram thing I showed you a few videos ago. Albert Camus, I said, well, he's a French-Algerian thinker. Where's Algeria? Well, that's in Northwest Africa, isn't it? Wasn't it like a French territory way back in the day? Yeah, good memory of your history. Okay, so he was born and grew up in Algeria, so this territory of France, and eventually made his way to France proper and became a famous Parisian intellectual. You know you're famous when they bestow a Nobel Prize on you, which happened to this guy for literature. All right, and I would say he's worthy of it personally. Like, I love his novels. I think they're like really wonderful. Anyhow, so let's get to his philosophical contribution, conceiving of existence in terms of what he calls the absurd. And the absurd here is the idea that existence itself is fundamentally absurd, unreasonable, ridiculous. So in case you've ever felt like you're in a weird world, like I was suggesting before when we were talking about Heidegger, there's another reason for that, not just the fact that, well, you know, we've more or less evolved an industry and technological world detached from any real understanding of ourselves or of the condition of being. The other reason why the world is so damn weird is that it's weird in principle. It's absurd in principle. It's ridiculous in principle from the ground up. So if you've ever occasionally experienced like, damn, I'm in such a absurd, strange, nonsensical world, from a Camusian point of view, there's a damn good reason for that, and it's because the absurd is an ontological category. It's something that runs throughout the entire fabric of our being as such. So that might help you make sense of some of the weirdness of your life. Or, I mean, if you don't think the world's absurd, look around, okay? Like, just start looking around, especially because we live in a, not just a political age like here in the United States, like I said before, but the world state of the coronavirus, I think, has in many ways underscored the fundamental absurdity of human existence and life in general, for that matter. If you don't believe you live in an absurd world, just take a look around these days, or any day for that matter. So here's another element, besides the absurd, here's another element of Camus' sort of take on things, that a lot of the time what we're doing with our lives is basically committing suicide. Dramatic pause. Okay, so for him, the question of suicide, to be or not to be, that's Hamlet's question, is actually the fundamental question of all philosophy. Right? You know, whether life is affirmable or not is the fundamental question. So, you know, things like, you know, antinatalism or ephilism, if you know what those are, they basically have to do with the question of whether life is affirmable, and if so, under what terms, and so on, is, you know, a very Camusian way of thinking about things. So what we normally do is we shut down our higher brain functions so that we don't have to sort of realize how absurd and ridiculous and nonsensical life actually is, and we shut down our higher brain functions so that we can sort of kill off our native curiosity, our childlike native curiosity and honesty about recognizing how absurd things really are. How do we do that? Well, one way we do that is by way of belief systems that seemingly answer life's fundamental questions for us. Questions like, where did we come from? Where are we going, especially after death? What is the meaning or point to human existence? Because the obvious reality is life tells us nothing about any of that. We have no concrete knowledge about any of life's most fundamental questions. And isn't that a dimension of the absurdity of human existence? That the questions for which we really long for the deepest and most convincing and most lucid answers are the last questions that life answers for us. In fact, it doesn't answer them for us at all. And isn't there something strange and absurd about that? That the knowledge that we yearn for is exactly the knowledge that life doesn't provide for us. Okay, so what do we do in response to that? Well, we try to shut down that disturbing realization and that disturbing sense of the absurd by believing in belief systems, like religious ones have been great at doing this. Not just Christianity, but every religious system more or less does this, that it sort of provides easy stopgap answers to shut down that anxiety-provoking sense of absurdity, you know, that we have no real answers, we don't know what the game is about. We're just sort of thrown here into the world to invent without knowing what the hell the rules are, or what the point, or even if there is a point to it, you know. So we believe in things like heaven and hell and God and whatever, the Valkyries, you know, if you're into sort of Norse, the Norse sort of ancient gods, and Wotan and Odin and whoever else, you know, Loki, etc., you know, or any other religious system does this. It helps sort of shut down our curiosity. It helps us commit a kind of suicide by killing off our inquiring minds that would otherwise be able to sort of confront the fact that, you know, life is just ridiculous in principle, and be honest about it and straightforward. We kill off that part of us because it makes us too anxious otherwise. Also, you know, like I said in your notes, there are secular ways of doing this same thing, so it's not just religion that performs this function. I think, like in our day, although Camus comments mostly on religion back in his day, he died in 1960, but I think in our day, which is, what, 60 years later, the main way that this happens is not necessarily by religion, but by way of our participation in commodity and entertainment culture. That one of the big reasons why we participate in that so avidly, you know, is because it helps shut down our sense of the absurd. It's a way, I think, of committing philosophical suicide no less potent than religion has been. throughout many centuries prior to our very technological age. That's why we're so sort of fixated on, you know, the kind of cell phone we have, and taking selfies all the time, and like all that kind of stuff. Because like if we weren't doing all that kind of stuff, we might realize that we're in a unreasonable existential predicament in simply being alive, and of course that's very anxiety provoking. All right, so number 8. Let's move on to number 8. Get into the last page of notes. Martin Buber. Okay, so you've heard this guy's name before too, and what I said very briefly is he's a thinker in the very theistic Judaic tradition, for sure. Writing in German, mostly 20th century. His most famous work is called I and Thou. It came out in 1923. Yes. So I and Thou, as the title suggests, means that what he's about is exploring I-thou relatedness. And the easiest way to think about this is in terms of an I-thou relation between people. Like when you address another person as a thou, as opposed to addressing another person as an it. Right? So when you address another person as an it, what you're basically doing is trying to manipulate, get what you want out of someone else, more or less treat another person like an object, objectifying other people, you know, that sort of thing. And his observation is we do a hell of a lot of that. We do a hell of a lot of manipulation between ourselves, maybe every now and then, although it's difficult. We address each other in some other way to recognize in the spontaneously unfolding moment the depth of who and what we really are. You address each other as a sacred thou. Okay. Now here's the deal for Buber. Like every time we do that, there's an implicit reference to what he calls the eternal thou in the book, which means God. Okay. So every instance of thou saying in your life is a way of addressing God, an indirect way of addressing God. So needless to say, his philosophy is very theistically oriented, a little bit like Kierkegaard in that regard, although he's coming at it from a Judaic perspective and Kierkegaard's coming at it from a Christian Protestant perspective. Okay, but irrespective of that, it's very theistic for sure, and it sort of sets up a challenge, I think a very interesting challenge. Like if you know, what is it to go around and every now and then like say thou to another human being? It's like sort of a disorienting thing, like really sort of see someone. Like we're hardly ever seen, we hardly ever see each other, not in a deep sense at any rate. We sort of see each other in just sort of glancing sort of ways, you know, but to really see someone, or to be seen by someone, to really speak to someone, or to be spoken to by someone, that hardly ever happens. But that's part of what Buber's philosophy is getting at, and I think in the process he's opening up the possibility for us to maybe do that a little bit more. Who knows, you know? I think the world could use it. I could be wrong about that. All right, so number nine is Franz Kafka. Okay, so Franz Kafka, we get the word in English Kafkaesque from that, which means sort of like the novels of Franz Kafka. And his novels, like probably the most famous one is The Metamorphosis, where this guy who's, what is he, like a salesman or something like that, and he wakes up in the form of an insect body, so a cockroach type body, and he's wiggling his legs around, and he's wondering how he's going to get to work and how he's going to do his job, which is a commentary on kind of the strange automaticity of how we live a large fraction of our lives. That, you know, you could find yourself converted to a cockroach and maybe your main thought would be like how do I get to the supermarket now, or something like that. It's like kind of a you know, a real sardonic, I guess, commentary on you know, sort of the strangeness of modern life. So his novels like The Castle and things like that are commentaries on the bleakness and once again the absurdity of our modern bureaucratic world, you know. like the world we inhabit, a technical world, a mechanical world, bureaucratic world, that has a very alienating and dehumanizing effect for a lot of people some fraction of the time. It's sort of a fairly bleak commentary on that. So Czechoslovakian, or I guess Czech Republic nowadays. And finally, the very last thing at the end of your notes, I wanted to make note of this guy whose name is Kirk Schneider. This guy is living. He's around, he's doing existential psychology, writing books, and he was a protege, actually, of Rollo May back in the day. Well, camera turned off again, but anyhow, like I was saying, I was mentioning Kirk Schneider as one of the definitely more prominent existential psychologists around today. Partly because he's a former West Georgia student, so go West, go Wolves, he rocks. Kirk Schneider, he's a great guy. I was at a conference with him one time, or maybe a couple conferences, I can't remember, but really neat, interesting guy who writes neat, interesting books in this existential vein, and, you know, I think a great guy. So I sort of wanted to give him a little shout out, as it were, at the end of this video. And maybe implicitly to encourage you guys, you students, you young students in this relatively early class. This is just supposed to be the second class you're taking here in the psychology department at West Georgia. Like some encouragement. It's like, yeah, man, you can take this degree and you can become world famous with it if you're so inclined and you're talented and all of that kind of stuff. But at any rate, OMG, ROFL. We have finished this segment of notes, this brief, very collapsed, very condensed tour through 9 different existential thinkers who have had a big influence on existential psychology and existential psychotherapy. And that's great, that's cool, it's hella dope, man. Anyhow, I hope you have a great day, wonderful day. I'm looking out there. It was raining earlier when I was doing this video, and now the sun has come out, so I guess the weather is a little bit labile, as we say. Okay, so at any rate, have a great day. Take care of yourself.